complaint to King Louis Philippe from a French pastry chef, only known as Monsieur Remontel, would end up being enough for the two nations of Mexico and France to not go to war just once, but twice. Welcome back to Historical Quarrel. Today we're going to be covering the first and second invasion of France, primarily because it's got a fucking ridiculous premise. The pastry chef complained that some army officers had essentially just stolen bread. I mean, they fucked up his shop pretty bad after reading through it. And France was like, you know what? We've had enough complaints that we're going to go to war. I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. Let's get right into it. Okay, to preface everything that we're about to go over, I'm going to list out some of the events leading up to the war. There was constant unrest in Mexico's political climate, constant change, different presidents taking over. We had the looting of French shops, the Mexican government's trade relationships with other countries, and France in particular. They fucked over France pretty hard, and the French weren't happy about that. The French ends up demanding 600,000 pesos as repayment for French immigrants' damages to their shops. And then number 5, the French end up just sending a blockade to all Mexican Gulf ports just to completely shut down their trade. So also just to kind of preface everything, this is the 1830s that we're talking about. And just before this, Mexico had recently lost Texas to the now newly formed Texan Republic. Not quite part of the United States, but also not part of Mexico anymore. That was, due to Santa Anna's defeat. And Santa Anna's also going to play a pivotal role in this as well. And if you don't know who that is, this guy, many Mexican historians will say the fate of Mexico is very intertwined with him back in the 1800s. And this is because he essentially rose up and became president of Mexico 8 different times. And this is after he would lose a whole bunch of battles. He kept flip-flopping on who he was supporting, which would sometimes be great for the country, sometimes just be awful. So he'd rise Mexico up, topple it down. Very conflicting figure in history. At the end of the day, in my opinion, I think this guy, he was a very charismatic leader. However, I think that he cared more about himself and that at the end of the day and more about his own hero status than he did about most of his people. I mean, he cared about his soldiers, obviously, and he used them pretty well in battles to the point where he would constantly be deemed a hero to the soldiers, and he was willing to fight in the front lines with them, and he was a very courageous, brave man, but also he was a little too macho. He was a little too much, and we'll get into that a little bit later because I'll kind of briefly go over his life once we get into him joining the war, because he comes out of retirement. He's essentially that one guy from Lethal Weapon. He's like, I'm too old for this shit, but he's gonna keep doing it and keep being a hero anyways. So let's get into it. This is the first French invasion, and the beginning of this all started with Remontel sending a letter to the King of France, and in it he stated that the Mexican government needed to pay him 60,000 pesos for damages done to his shop. It was actually valued at about 1,000 pesos at the end of the day. But not just him, but multiple other businessmen were complaining about the rioting and the looting that was constantly going on back then. They would constantly just have even Mexican government army officials and officers just show up and destroy these shops and take whatever the fuck they wanted. With Remontel, they stole his bread, stole his little pastries and sweets. In one of the articles I read from the Mexican side of things for this war, they were like, yeah, this guy complained just because some officers had shown up and ate some of his bread. They didn't go into the fact that they looted the building and basically destroyed it. Which is understandable. I mean, whenever you're presenting your side of the story, you want to make yourself look good, and they definitely did that there. There's widespread civil disorder because of all this. As factions competed for control of the country, the fighting often resulted in the destruction of looting private property. Average citizens had few options for claiming compensation, as they had no representatives to speak on their behalf, foreigners especially. So this is where the French immigrants would try to appeal to the Mexican government, and the government would essentially just shut them down and be like, no, I ain't gonna pay you shit. Which is also semi-understandable. They're more concerned with taking care of their citizens and gaining power to try and, control the whole country again. When no one was really able to do that for a while, Antonio Bustamante was kind of doing that. So not only that, though, but you also had some, commercial relationships between France and Mexico being on rocky terms. A lot of this was due to France refusing to recognize them as a independent nation prior to the 1830s, and this was because they had an alliance with Spain, and the French hate Spain. Maybe not today, but like back then they fucking hated them constantly, like just in battles, at war with them, and because of that they were like, nah, you guys aren't a real country, fuck off. And then eventually they got over their whole spiel of Spain and they decided to recognize them, and so they quickly became Mexico's third largest trading partner. However, Mexico, due to them still being bitter about not being recognized by them until much later, they gave them much higher tariffs and taxes on all of their goods, which the French would lose, not necessarily lose a whole bunch of money, but they wouldn't be gaining as much as they could, like the U.S. and the Great Britain were. So, in addition to that, they would end up, King Louis Philippe would end up being like, okay, so from all these damages and claims that we keep getting from our, past citizens who are immigrants in their country, we're going to demand about 600,000 pesos from you guys. And Antonio Bustamante was like, sure, like, yeah, I'm going to do it. And, the French kept waiting. They kept being like, hey, you need to send us the money. And Bustamante was like, it's like when a friend borrows money from you and you're just like, hey, I do need you to pay me back. And they just keep, texting back, yeah, no, I'm getting at it, man. Don't worry. Like, Bustamante did that. And the French were one of those friends who was like very, very insistent on to get that money back. So when that didn't happen, King Louis Philippe ended up ordering about... Here, I'm looking through my notes right here. Ordered a fleet under Rear Admiral Charles Baudin to declare and carry out a blockade of all Mexican ports on the Gulf of Mexico from Yucatan to Rio Grande, to bombard the Mexican fortress of San Juan de Ulua, and to seize the city of Veracruz, which was the most important port on the Gulf Coast. So with that command in place, they began the war. First, the blockades came, and they started stopping their trade. So Mexicans began to try and smuggle imports in Mexico via Corpus Christi, which was part of the Republic of Texas at that point, which they just recently lost. And then because of the Republic of Texas fearing that France would blockade the Republic's ports as well, and they would lose their newly gained independence, a battalion of Texan forces began patrolling Corpus Christi Bay to stop Mexican smugglers. One of those smuggling parties abandoned their cargo of just a whole bunch of flour on the beach, the Mouth Bay, which gave Flour Bluff its name. And then the United States ended up sent the schooner Woodbury to help the French in their blockade. So U.S. would eventually join and help them in their blockade with the ports, because they didn't want to anger the French, obviously, as they're an ally. And with Mexico, they've kind of just been at war with them as well. And it's a rocky relationship. Yes, they're one of their biggest trading partners, but at the same time, it's, hey, you're our neighbor and got some land that we want to take. We love taking land, obviously. So, meanwhile, acting without explicit government authority, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, known for his military leadership, came out of retirement. So he kind of just did it by himself. Anyways, from his hacienda de Manga de Clavo near Jalapa, and surveyed defenses de Veracruz. He offered his services to the government, which ordered him to fight the French by any means necessary. He led Mexican forces against the French and fought at the Battle of Veracruz, which was just insane. So it was a naval engagement that pitted the French frigate squadron under Rear Admiral Charles Baudin against the Mexican citadel San Juan de Ulua, which defended the city of Veracruz from the 27th of November to December 5th. So all in all, about 2-ish weeks. Not even that. No, just like a full week of fighting. Having crossed the Atlantic to settle the dispute between France and Mexico, the squadron anchored off Veracruz and negotiated until all diplomatic means to resolve the disputes appeared exhausted. After announcing the hostilities would begin, Baudin had his squadron bombard the fort. French fire, particularly heavy mortars mounted on bomb vessels and Paction's guns on frigates, silenced the citadel and forced it to surrender on the 28th of November. So, in a day. They surrendered in a day, forcing Baudin to mount a raid against the city itself on December 5th. Despite its limited ground forces, the French squadron succeeded in capturing General Mariano Arista and in wounding General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna. And more than just wounding, while they were fighting, Santa Anna had his leg shot by a French grape shot, and he kept fighting. The guy was very macho. Like when I was talking about him being macho, he's el macho. Like he's the guy. And they ended up burying his leg with full military honors. And because of his heroic deeds in this battle, it actually ended up helping him launch himself back into the political stratosphere and become president or dictator of Mexico once again. The swift capture of the citadel by a small squadron of relatively light warships stunned military observers who had gathered to watch the scene, and marked the beginning of the era of shell artillery and the modernization of navies around the world. Politically, the attack undermined the Mexican regime while bolstering the prestige of Santa Anna. So it basically made the current Mexican regime under Antonio Bustamante look like shit. And then after the French were done doing their naval raid, they decided to do the ground raid on Veracruz. The capture of San Juan de Ulua came as a surprise to the Mexican government, which declared war on France, and they expelled all of the French citizens established in Mexico. Relieved, General Rincon of command and sent an army of 3,200 men. So they relieved him of his command, and they sent an additional army of 3,200 men under General Santa Anna and General Arista to retake Veracruz. This army reached the city in short order, prompting French residents to flee to the fortress. Baudin, who expected negotiations to start again because he was like, okay, we just like fucked you guys up. Like, I figure you guys want to negotiate now. You guys ain't down to, keep fighting this, right? Like that would be downright stupid. Anyways, they were pretty dumb and decided to try and fight. But Baudin decided to answer the challenge by a raid on Veracruz in addition to the garrison and newly arrived forces. The city was protected by a belt of fortifications. It was, however, a small city, and its layout was well known to the French because they had multiple citizens living there for quite a while, and they've obviously done a whole bunch of recon beforehand. Baudin thus decided to attempt a swift surprise strike to disarm the forts and kidnap General Santa Anna. To strengthen the sparse forces available, the soldiers of the artillery and engineering were reinforced by sailors from the crews of the ships. On December 5th, at 5 in the morning, boats from the squadron landed 1,500 men on the beaches before Veracruz, so that they split into 3 columns. 2 wings ascended the city walls near the strongholds of Santiago and Concepcion. The Mexicans were taken by surprise, so much so that no shots were fired. The 2 groups sabotaged the cannons and ran on the wall to reach the opposite side of the city. The central column under François de Joinville was tasked with blowing up the door commanding access to the harbor, stormed the city, and attacked the buildings where the Mexican generals were thought to be staying. This largely succeeded, as the door was destroyed as planned, and the column reached the Mexican headquarters almost unopposed. They essentially blitzed the city. They like, I don't know, this shit's crazy to me. They're in home territory. You figure that they would have had rotating shifts, but no. Santa Anna was like, nah, they're not gonna trying to ground assault. That's ridiculous. Bothan was like, no, let's do a ground assault because we have spare firepower and we're gonna just fuck them up. So without any shots being fired, they take Veracruz, which is wild to me. Very great maneuvering here by Baldin. Very smart guy. Anyways, the French retreated with their prisoner. So once they got Santa Anna, Mexican soldiers began to put up a resistance, and Santa Anna managed to escape, but they ended up capturing Arista. So the French would end up retreating with their prisoner, fighting on the way with a unit of Mexican troops stationed in a monastery being used as barracks. Baldin, who had disembarked, declared the mission accomplished and ordered his men to re-embark. The two wing columns retreated without difficulties, but as the central column completed its re-embarkment, it was hit by a counterattack led by Santa Anna. The French opened fire with captured cannons and with light carronades of the boats, firing grape shot that killed and maimed the Mexicans. Santa Anna himself had his horse killed under him and was severely wounded. This is where he would end up losing his leg. So Santa Anna was pretty important here. He did end up eluding capture, and he got his leg shot off. So he fought to the bitter end. He really did try and not just get absolutely floored by Baldin. So the French had sustained about 8 killed and 56 wounded, mostly from friendly fire and the confusion of the Mexican counterattack. Because they were they weren't expecting a counterattack at that point. They were like, well, we have everyone captured. The city's ours. No one's going to launch a counterattack us. We wrecked them, guys. We outmaneuvered them. Santa Anna was like, no, we fight to the death, which is pretty ballsy. But still ended up losing. The Mexicans suffered about 31 killed and 26 wounded, according to the account of Santa Anna. 5 bullet impacts were found on Baldin's own boat. Only 5, which is, not too bad. The double defeat in San Juan de Ulua and Veracruz itself included the Mexican government to reopen negotiations to settle the conflict. So, after they lost twice, very, very easily, they finally were like, okay, we'll talk, and maybe we might consider paying you guys. The Mexican army evacuated Veracruz, but it remained under the authority of the Bustamante government. While the French army remained stationed in the fort, the British offered their mediation to ease the process, dispatching their Northern American squadron in the Gulf of Mexico, along with Ambassador Richard Pakenham with a fleet. The peace treaty was eventually signed on March 9th, 1839, whereby the Mexican government relented. The 600,000 pesos were paid, and French residents of Mexico enjoyed better protection. The squadron returned to Brest on the 15th of August, 1839, after losing 24 men to yellow fever. So they lost almost the same amount. They lost almost triple the amount of men to disease than they did from this first war, which is also kind of sad because it's like you live through that war and it's like, oh great, I captured a city, and then you're almost home and you just fucking die of fever. Man, 1800s were wild. I would hate living back then. Anyways, the fall of San Juan de Ulua came as a surprise to the world. Neutral observers, notably from HMS Satellite, under Captain Robb and USS Levant, reported the effect of the French bombardment. Lord Wellington is often reported to have stated in the House that the incident was the only recorded example of a strong fort overwhelmed entirely by a naval squadron. I like to also credit that to Baldin just outmaneuvering the Mexican government at this point, the army and their navy. He was just very smart, very tactic driven. He wanted negotiations to happen. When that didn't happen, he still tried to find a way to do it without killing a whole bunch of people. He was just a very, very great admiral, very great commander to serve under. And so I'd say it's more on him. And I mean, the bombardment was very strong. They did have, very powerful Pakshans guns. Even though the frigates had ended up actually firing about 7,771 round shots and only 177 Pakshan shells. So, I mean, the frigates did more of the work. Well, they probably had to do more. The Pakshan shells probably ended up causing a little bit more destruction overall, so they didn't have to do as much. The bomb catches had themselves fired about 302 mortar bombs and were credited with the destruction of the Mexican ammunition depots. And the American observer, Admiral David Farragut, reported the effects of the shells in the fort. The fight also served as confirmation to the usefulness of steamers to assist traditional warships in their maneuvers. Even though they were fitted with only 100 horsepower engines and paddles, they had efficiently positioned the frigates to their optimum firing positions. So just super quick. They're, maybe not like super quick, but they're faster and help them maneuver, without, the need of like good winds and all these other things. It really helped them just take this fort. And the fort was very well, it was fortified, very well defended, but it just, again, outmaneuvered, outplayed. Baldin fucked them up pretty bad. In Mexico, the war shook the political landscape. General Santa Anna, who previously had been discredited by the Texas Revolution because, he was hailed as a hero for his ultimately failed attempt at a counterattack, severely wounded. He had his leg amputated on December 6th and battled death for days. He was on death's door, and he still got out of there again. Very macho, very stubborn, just very, very impressive guy overall. Just kind of a jackass, in my opinion. Some people like him. I personally think he just cared more about his reputation than the people that he was supposed to try and help. His people. His narration of the battle made him very popular, of course, because he can make himself look awesome, to the point where his leg was buried in Mexico with full military honors. Santa Anna seized power on the 20th of March, 1839, in a coup de grace, furthering the political instability that had been the cause of the conflict. In France, the expedition elevated 2 officers to prominence, Badin, good, an elderly veteran of the Napoleonic era, and the 20-year-old Prince de Joinville, the third son of the ruling Louis Philippe, who had commanded the Creole. I cannot pronounce. Bad with French. I speak Spanish, but don't speak French. I learned French in high school, and I learned a little bit. I learned 2 words, essentially, and then I speak Spanish. And I'm fluent in that. So I was able to actually read some of the Mexican accounts and papers on this, and it's very interesting, their perspective on everything. He was promoted to during the bombardment and the main column during the raid. Vela became a hero and used his prestige to promote technical innovations like steam power. Oh, that's good. So he was like, hey guys, this thing fucking worked. Let's keep doing more steam power. So awesome. He was promoted to Capitaine de Vassal and to Knight in the Order of the Legion of Honor. The tactics used by the French squadron and its use of steam power shell artillery were a prelude to the events in the Crimean War. So this is the end of the first Pastry War. This is, in all reality, this is the end of part 1 to a 2-part war. You have the first invasion and you have the second invasion. All this part literally just started because French businessman was like, hey man, they fucked up my pastry shop. And the king was like, you know what? Let's help them out. Let's help the immigrants out, and let's get Mexico to give us better trade agreement. Which was in the negotiations. They got a much better deal out of it at the end of the day, and they still got them to agree to pay, roughly 600,000 pesos. So this leads us into part 2. All right, guys, let's get into the second French invasion, or as I like to call it, Pastry War Part 2, Electric Boogaloo. Boo! So, fast forward about 30-ish years, well, more like 20 years from the end of the Pastry War. This was an invasion of Mexico launched in 1862 by the Second French Empire. So the French had gone through quite like an extra revolution at this point and created a whole new empire, which had hoped to replace the Mexican Republic with a monarchy favorable to French interests. After the administration of Mexican President Benito Juarez placed a moratorium on foreign debt payments in 1861, France, the United Kingdom, and Spain agreed to the Convention of London, a joint effort to ensure the debt repayments from Mexico would be forthcoming. On the 8th of December 1861, the three navies disembarked their troops at the port city of Veracruz on the Gulf of Mexico. So they're going back to Veracruz to fuck them up again. However, when the British discovered that France had an ulterior motive and unilaterally planned to seize Mexico, the United Kingdom separately negotiated an agreement with Mexico to settle the debt issues and withdrew from the country. Spain subsequently left as well, because again, Spain hates the fucking French. The resulting French invasion established the Second Mexican Empire, 1864 to 1867, so about 3 years. Many European states acknowledged the political legitimacy of the newly created monarchy, while the United States refused to recognize it because, fuck the crown. That's what we do here in the U.S. You think you can be king? Fuck that. Hell no. We fought off our king, got our own country. Fuck you guys. The intervention came as a civil war. The Reform War had just concluded, and the intervention allowed the opposition against the liberal social and economic reforms of President Juarez to take up their cause once again. The Mexican Catholic Church, upper-class conservatives, much of the Mexican nobility, and some Native American communities welcomed and collaborated with the French Empire's installation of Maximilian von Habsburg as Emperor of Mexico. The emperor himself, however, proved to be of liberal inclination and continued some of Juarez's government's most notable liberal measures. Some liberal generals defected to the empire, including the powerful northern governor Santiago Vidarruri. Man, why? I speak Spanish. I actually have never seen the last name before. Vidaurri, who had fought on the side of Juarez during the Reform War. So this guy had helped Juarez, and, French wanted to replace him, but the guy they replaced him with was kind of like Juarez 2.0. So the French rapidly captured much of the Mexican territory, including major cities, but guerrilla warfare remained rampant. And I'm talking like rampant. Many of the battles aren't going to be recorded as well, and this is because a lot of it came from Mexico's own citizens just being like, no, fuck that, I'm tired of all these empires and countries coming in and just taking over and trying to tell us how to live our lives. And so they would have guerrilla warfare tactics that they would utilize, similar fashion to how Native Americans would fight back against the U.S. multiple times before the U.S. did eventually take over. The intervention was increasingly using up troops and money at the time when the recent Prussian victory over Austria was inclining France to give greater military priority to European affairs. So, France was already kind of eyeing Prussia and thinking about how to deal with them because of what was happening in Austria. And so they're wasting a lot of time and material on a nation that they weren't sure is really going to give them a whole bunch of profit or not yet. And give them, really, really anything out of it. So the liberals also never lost the official recognition of the United States, which began providing material support following the end of the American Civil War in 1865. Invoking the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. government made it clear that it would not tolerate a lasting French presence on the continent, and the French finally began to leave in 1866. The empire would only last a few more months. Forces loyal to Juarez captured Maximilian and executed him in June of 1867, restoring the Republic. So, essentially, this whole Second War was France, being like, okay, so they're going to try and, have us not pay this debt. We're fucking mad about that. So let's just try and, gain the country. And Britain didn't like that, and Spain didn't like that either. And they were like, France would have easily won with Britain and Spain's support. However, without them, and then the U.S. also pulling out, there was no way in hell that was going to happen. Also during this, we can get into the tripartite expedition, which on December 14th, 1861, a Spanish fleet sailed and took position at the port of Veracruz. They were occupied. Anyways, this expedition essentially is what led to a lot of the country deciding not to pay. And then on April 9th of 1862, that's when everything officially started, because France decided to start their invasion. And during this too, during the battles, Santa Anna actually comes out of retirement again, and he decides to support Maximilian, like the emperor, and then he flips back to Juarez as like a commander. And because of him flipping back and forth between the emperor and Juarez, they end up deciding just to fucking exile this guy, because they're like, you are too dangerous, like you are too charismatic, you are going to cause this country to split itself all over again after we just reunited this republic. Get the fuck out of here. And they ended up exiling him to Jamaica. They're like, get as far away from here as possible, we're tired of your shit, Santa. And then oh gosh, and so this whole thing ended up causing the fall of Mexico City, and the French did get Mexico City. They got everyone there. That's how they're able to install Maximilian for the little bit that they were able to. And then you had imperial success in central provinces. Franco-Mexican forces captured Pachua and Tulancingo in July to serve as bases for expanding operations. Imperial Juan Chavez, under the command of General Mejia, defeated liberal Thomas Oron on the road to Guanajuato. Oron would then switch sides and join the Imperialists. The Imperialist Colonel Jose Antonio Rodriguez then captured San Juan de los Llanos in Puebla. The port of Tampico was captured by French vessels on the 11th of August. French control of the country still centered on Veracruz and Mexico City. So after they captured Veracruz and Mexico City, they had to try and maintain control. In August, the Imperialist General Thomas Mejia captured the town of Actopan, Hidalgo, in the state of Mexico in September, and more Imperialist victories in that state followed. The Imperialist Gavito managed to disperse the Republican guerrillas in Coayuca, and the Imperialist Jesus Maria Visoso managed to defeat Republican guerrillas at Puebla. Franco-Mexican forces under Leonardo Marquez, again, they just kept capturing different cities. This was during their advance. The French General Bazin occupied the city of Guadalajara on the 5th of January. Then Uraga and Ortega remained in the vicinity but carried out no attacks. After French assaults led by General Abel Duay, Ortega retreated towards Fresnillo and Uraga westward. Mexican General Felipe Navarrete of Yucatan proclaimed his support of the empire and invaded the state capital of Merida with the support of French forces, capturing it on 22nd of January. Duay, with General Castañeda, headed north, capturing Aguas Calientes and Zacatecas by the 7th of February in 1864. Castañeda was left in charge of Zacatecas, while Duay went to the relief of Colonel Garnier at Guadalajara. On the 16th of February, they took about 80 prisoners. They were fucking up the Republic's forces. They were destroying Juarez just constantly. This ended up changing as the further north they ended up pushing in their southern campaign. This is where the Republican army would start coming back, and General Ortega would end up, taking back a very central ravine, which would allow them to get more supplies and to start kind of, having some oomph as they're pushing back. During this time too, this is where America decided to pull out. of their of helping the French, and the French were getting more focused on European affairs, and so they started retreating their troops, and then eventually they were all just left with Veracruz and Mexico City. After Veracruz was recaptured, Mexico City ended up being their last bastion, and a lot of this was just from the imperialists that they installed. The French had just kind of completely left at that point. And with the end of the official French presence, the intervention was technically over, yet the empire, which French troops and their Mexican collaborators had set up, would last for a few months more. Again, because the French had just instilled this dogma for a few years at this point. And Mexican generals that had previously fought alongside French continued playing a leading role, along with hundreds of Frenchmen that remained as independent mercenaries. So the mercenaries stayed, but the main armies of France retreated back to their country. After a council at Orizaba, which decided against his abdication, Maximilian intended to return to Mexico City, first remaining at Puebla for nearly 3 weeks and making preparations for the campaign. The country was divided into 3 great military districts, the western comprising provinces of North Colima, including Durango, Chihuahua, the eastern stretching from Aguascalientes to Tampico northward, and the central embracing all the vast remainder to Chiapas. Miramon, who took command of the western district, and had already set out to create his army with little regard for the means to be employed. But Mejia in the east stood at the head of nearly 4,000 men, and Marquez, controlling the center, had 4,000 under Ramon Mendez in Michoacan, and fully 2,000 troops stationed at Puebla. Maximilian assumed the supreme command and issued orders for the active formation of the new national army as well as militia. Unfortunately for the empire, the western and eastern military district were in possession of the Republicans as well as the region of the South Puebla, while the few remaining central provinces were overrun by hostile bands and about to be invaded by the Republican armies. Funds and resources were also lacking, again, because they just set up all these troops and were like, okay guys, fight. And the troops were like, well, we're gonna get paid, and they're like, I don't know, maybe. So, and that maybe wasn't enough, and they ended up, losing a ton of their troops, and people would just retreat or abandon because, again, not worth it. It's not worth it to fight your own people for something that you don't wholeheartedly believe in, unless you have a financial incentive or you have some other incentive. But they didn't set anything up. And, they didn't have enough to, for supplies even. And so some of the troops would end up just starving. And they're like, fuck this, not worth it. I'd rather just go back to having Juarez in control. And so that's what ended up happening. And after they captured Maximilian, they decided to execute him. And this is where our story ends up ending, as Juarez becomes president in the national capital again. He made a few changes in policy, given that the progressive Maximilian had upheld most of Juarez's liberal reforms. So he was still like, well, I'll make a few changes, okay? Because, he did hold up a lot of the liberal reforms that were happening. After the victory, the Conservative Party was so thoroughly discredited by its alliance with the invading French troops that it effectively became defunct. The Liberal Party was almost unchallenged as a political force during the first years of the restored republic. In 1871, however, Juarez was re-elected to yet another term as president, in spite of a constitutional prohibition of re-elections. The French intervention ended with the Republican-led government being more stable and more stable, in both internal and external forces were now kept at bay. Porfirio Diaz, a liberal general and a hero of the French War, but increasingly conservative and alcoholic, one of the losing candidates, launched a rebellion against the president, supported by conservative factions within the Liberal Party. The attempted revolt, the so-called Plan de la Noria, was already at the point of defeat when in Osaka, 4 years later, 1876, when Lerdo ran for re-election, Diaz launched a second successful revolt, the Plan de Tuxtepec, and captured the presidency. He held it through 8 terms until 1911, now known as the Porfiriato. After many decades of civil wars, Mexico had finally exhausted itself, and the general Porfirio Diaz had forced peace through his regime with no big rebellions or coups occurring. France's adventure in Mexico had improved relations with Austria through Maximilian, but produced no result as France had politically alienated itself in the international community. During 1866, Prussia went to war with France's indirect ally Austria, which was promptly defeated while French troops were still in Mexico, unable to affect the situation in Europe. As for Napoleon's empire, it would later collapse in 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War. So, during all of this, France was essentially just trying to take over more land. Napoleon wanted to conquer the world. That was his main plan. And Santa Anna kept flip-flopping between Juarez and Maximilian. Like, he, a total of about 4 times, would switch back and forth during these wars. And now the 4th time, going back to Juarez, they captured him and just was like, hey, fuck it, you go. Go to Jamaica and die. He didn't die there. He ended up coming back, but he was disgraced and he lived poor for the last few years of his life. And legless. Yeah, he still didn't have his leg. Goddamn. And that leg was still buried with military honors. Crazy ass guy right there. He'd be interesting. This is weird to promote, but I listened to, a podcast called Time Suck that really inspired me to start my own, and I think he'd be interesting to do a full Time Suck on. Dan does a very good job of researching historical figures and going very in depth with them. I'm more doing just like brief overviews of a war and like how petty squabble would lead into all these battles, and I think the total amount of lives lost were in the thousands for the second French invasion. Ended up going to the thousands all over a pastry shop getting destroyed by riots, and because Bustamante was like, I don't want to pay jack shit to immigrants and I don't care about protecting them. So I think the lesson here is we should protect our immigrants and not piss off other countries that might be slightly stronger than us. I hope you guys enjoyed this, enjoyed listening. This is more kind of just going over very specifics of not specifics, but more brief overview of a war. We can have a laugh at the fact that it was caused by a pastry shop getting destroyed. It was very silly. Next week, we're going to go over the Nika riots, which happened in 532 AD. They're regarded as the most violent riots in the city's history, with nearly half of Constantinople getting just burned and destroyed, and tens of thousands of people killed. And the reason for this was because people were pissed about chariot racing. Like, it was all because of chariot racing and some emperor causing some problems for a sports team. So if you think the Brazilian riots for like football games are bad, this shit was even crazier. I'm having a fun time reading up and learning a lot on it. Hopefully by next week I'll have that episode up and going over pretty in depth about just how silly it is. But yeah, they burned an entire city because of a sports game. Could you fucking imagine if like in America we did that today? Like, shit, man. Fucking the president decided to make this move illegal, which is what our team was good at. You know what? Fuck it. Let's Civil War again. Let's destroy the country that supports them, because fuck you guys. So I just think that's wild. I think it's interesting. I'm trying to do better. I know I probably sound a little off-putting, or like I listen to myself as I'm doing this, and really I'm practicing, getting better. So I'm hoping to sound better. I got a pop filter. I'm hoping that helps some of the issue that was going on. But that's all for today. Let me know what I can do better. Let me know if there's any interesting things you'd like me to talk about. I'm going to start a separate thing that's just called Random Tangents. As I'm like researching for things, I'll be going over that a little more later, but I already launched an episode. It covered bestiality and humans' history with that. Thank you guys again for listening. I know not a lot of people are listening, but whoever is, thank you. I appreciate it, and you have a great day. Bye-bye.